The Grand Ceremonial Hall of the Vethori Confederacy's military headquarters had hosted 87 coalition banquets and had, in 87 iterations, produced 87 identical seating arrangements in the essential structure. A fact that the Protocol Division cited with the specific pride of an institution that understood consistency as its primary professional contribution. Sergeant Ren Voss had been briefed on the seating structure twice before the banquet, once in the General Coalition briefing that all human contingent personnel received, and once by Corporal Marin, who had attended a previous coalition event in a supporting capacity, and who had provided the briefing with the specific energy of someone sharing intelligence they considered operationally valuable. Table 16, Marin had said, was good. Table 16 was in the outer third, which meant the sound levels were manageable and the food arrived hot rather than progressively cooled by the distance from the kitchen, and the sight lines to the dais were not so direct that you were obligated to pay attention to the speeches for the entire duration. Ren had found Table 16 to be accurately described. He was on the third course and the Vethori logistics specialist on his left, a senior specialist named Velkorath, who had the specific storytelling quality of someone who had been in supply chain operations for 30 years and had accumulated material that was funny in proportion to how impossible it was that it was real. Was 11 minutes into an account of a requisition dispute involving 6 departments, a classification error that had persisted for 4 months, and a final resolution that had required the intervention of a general who had died 15 years earlier, and whose posthumous authority had been invoked through a documentation technicality that Velkorath was building toward with the patient construction of a master storyteller. Ren was genuinely interested in where the documentation technicality was going. He was aware, in the ambient, peripheral way that military training built in, of the head table, the dais, elevated by 2 steps, carrying the Empress and her generals and the senior diplomatic corps, and the weight of the room's formal architecture in the specific way that head tables at these events carried it, as a fixed reference point against which everything else was spatially organized. He had looked at the head table twice, the first time to orient himself when he sat down, the second time because Marin had described the Empress as worth seeing, and Marin was, in Ren's experience, reliably accurate about things worth seeing. She was worth seeing. She had the composed presence of someone who occupied positions of authority the way buildings occupied land, not by asserting it, but by simply being there, the authority and inherent quality of the existence rather than something performed. The Vethori chromatic biology was visible at the formal distance, the slight iridescence that the briefing documents described as species characteristic, more pronounced in the secondary circulatory markings. Running at the formal reception register, he'd read about rather than the higher activity patterns that different circumstances produced. She was eating. She was speaking to the general on her right. She was, in the ambient accounting of the room, exactly where she was supposed to be. Velkorath had arrived at the documentation technicality. The documentation technicality was, as Ren had suspected it might be, the best part of the story. He was smiling at the documentation technicality when he became aware, through the specific, animal part of military instinct that processed changes in a room's ambient quality before the conscious mind caught up with them, that something in the hall had shifted. He looked toward the dais. The Empress was standing. This was, in itself, not unprecedented. The formal program included standing portions, toasts, the recognition address. But the standing had a quality that was not the standing of a scripted portion of the program. It had the quality of a decision. She descended from the dais, 1 step, 2, and moved into the main floor of the hall with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who had determined a direction and was going in it. She passed the High Command's table. She passed the Coalition General's table. She passed the Senior Diplomatic Corps. Velkorath had stopped talking. Ren became aware that Velkorath had stopped talking, and that the table had gone quiet, and that the tables around them had gone quiet, and that the quality of quiet was spreading across the hall in the organized way of silence that was being caused by something rather than simply occurring, and he followed the direction of every head he could see in his peripheral vision, which was all pointed toward the same thing, which was the Empress of the Vethori Confederacy walking through the Grand Ceremonial Hall toward the outer third. She stopped at table 16. She looked at the empty chair to Ren's right, the chair that had been empty since the beginning, because the seating arrangement had allocated it to a coalition signals officer who had been rerouted at the last moment and had not been replaced, and she sat in it. She picked up her fork. She ate. 412 military professionals and diplomatic staff, looking at the Empress sitting at table 16 beside a human sergeant who was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just recategorized the entire evening, produced the most complete silence the Grand Ceremonial Hall had achieved in 87 banquets. Ren held very still. His plate was in front of him. He did not eat from it because eating from it required a decision about what to do with his hands, and he had not reached the decision yet. He had reached the decision to hold very still and assess, which was the correct first step, and he was executing it. The silence had been going for approximately 40 seconds when she spoke. "You were at grid 7, she said. It was not loud. It was meant for him rather than the room, which meant nothing, because the room was 412 people in total silence, and quiet carried in total silence, the way any sound carried in a space that had removed everything else. He heard it, the tables nearest him heard it, the tables near those tables heard it, in the specific rippling way of information that moved through a silent space. "Yes," he said, because it was true and because there was no other available response. "Holding the eastern defensive line," she said, "during the extraction." "Yes," he said. "My son's unit came through your position," she said. "Third Vethori armored, secondary element. They were moving nor-northeast under fire." His account, she paused, in the specific way that a pause arrived when someone was choosing whether to say a thing and had decided to say it. He gave me his account 3 days after the engagement. He described a human soldier who stayed at the position after the extraction order came through, who held the line while they moved, who was still firing when they cleared the range. Ren was quiet for a moment. "He told me 17 minutes, she said. "I don't know exactly how long," Ren said. "I wasn't looking at the time." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you were." She looked at her plate. Then she looked at him with the direct quality of a woman who had been carrying something for 3 weeks and had decided exactly how she was going to deliver it and was delivering it. "I have been at coalition banquets for 22 years. I have recognized meritorious service in the standard ways for 22 years. When I found your name on the roster, I determined that the standard ways were not adequate for this particular service, and I have been trying to determine what was adequate since." She looked at the chair she was sitting in. "I decided this was adequate, sitting where you sat rather than summoning you to where I sit." Ren looked at the chair he was sitting in. He thought about grid 7. He thought about 17 minutes, which he remembered differently from the outside account. Not as heroism, which was an interpretation added by distance, but as the specific, granular sequence of a position that needed to be held, and the particular 45-second intervals in which he had understood how long he could hold it. "His unit made it clear," Ren said. "Yes," she said. "That was the objective," he said. She looked at him. Her chromatic markings were doing something he did not have a reference document for, not the formal register he had seen from the dais, but something lower and more specific, something that had the quality of an expression rather than a display. "Yes," she said. "That was the objective, you held it." She paused. "He is 26 years old." Ren heard the number in the register it was meant. Not military data, not a unit designation. A mother telling him how old her son was. "I'm glad he's all right," Ren said, which was the truest thing available and the only thing adequate to the number 26. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate and ate, and he picked up his fork and ate. And at table 16, in the specific and unprecedented quiet of 412 people who had stopped talking and had not found a reason to start again, the Empress of the Vethori Confederacy and a sergeant from the 7th Support Unit had dinner together. At the High Command's table, General Velsorin, 43 years of service, 8 coalition campaigns, the specific, seasoned quality of a military commander who had seen most of the significant things there were to see and had categorized them, was looking at table 16 with the expression of a man doing something precise and internal. He had served under Empress Vel Anthesara for 22 years. He had watched her receive coalition reports, deliver formal recognitions, manage the specific, continuous performance of a sovereign at 87 banquets, and maintain the composed distance that the position required with the consistency of someone who had decided, early in her reign, that the position's requirements were what they were, and that meeting them was a form of respect for the people who needed the position to be what it was. He had never seen her stand up without a scripted reason. He had never seen her leave the dais during a banquet except for the formal procession that opened and closed the event. He had, in 43 years of service, developed the ability to assess unusual situations with the calm of a man who had learned that most unusual situations were explicable if you waited for the explanation. He was waiting for the explanation. At the diplomatic core table, 3 senior ambassadors were having a quiet, rapid conversation that had the quality of people consulting each other on a document they all needed to assess simultaneously. At the coalition officers' table, the senior Vethori general had the expression of a man who was revising an understanding. At the surrounding tables, the specific, ambient recalibration of 412 professionals processing an unprecedented event was producing a sound that was not quite the normal dinner noise and was not quite silence, the sound of a room doing 2 things at once. Velkorath, at table 16, was looking at his plate with the specific, disciplined focus of a logistics specialist who had decided that the appropriate posture in this situation was to eat his food and not make eye contact with anyone and allow the situation to develop without his participation. He had, in 30 years of supply chain operations, survived a significant number of unusual situations through the strategic application of not participating, and he was applying it now with the focus of a professional. He was also, in the peripheral accounting that he could not turn off, deeply fascinated. The story that Wren had interrupted at the documentation technicality. He had found, after approximately 8 minutes of strategic non-participation, that he could not resume it. The documentation technicality was still there, still funny, still the best part, but the moment for it had passed, which was a professional disappointment. He filed it for future deployment and ate his food. The banquet's formal program had stalled at the point where the Empress had stood up, because the formal program was scripted around her location, and her location was no longer on the dais. The protocol aides in the room's periphery were conducting quiet, urgent consultations. The program director, visible at the side entrance, had the expression of a person looking at documentation that did not address the current situation and was becoming aware that it was not going to address it. The senior aide closest to the dais, a young woman named Velkethori who had been in her post for 8 months and who was, in Velsorin's assessment, going to be an excellent aide once she had processed this evening, was looking at the Empress's empty chair with the focused attention of someone trying to determine whether the chair required a response, and if so, what kind. The chair did not require a response. The Empress was at table 16. The chair was empty. These were the facts, and the facts did not resolve into a procedural action, and so the aide stood in her post and waited, which was the right call. By the 50-minute mark, the banquet had found a new equilibrium. Not the equilibrium it had started with. That equilibrium was not available anymore, and the hall had understood this and had adjusted. The adjustment had taken approximately 12 minutes, during which the ambient noise had moved from silence through a low, careful murmur and back to something approaching normal dinner conversation, with the specific quality of conversations that were happening around a central awareness rather than instead of one. 412 people were talking to each other and were also, in the ambient and continuous way, aware of Table 16. At Table 16, the conversation had moved. It had moved in the way that Ren had not expected, and had stopped expecting to expect things about approximately 15 minutes in, which was when he had understood, in the practical, soldiers' way of understanding situations by their behavior rather than their category, that the Empress was not performing informality. She was not deploying a carefully calibrated register of approachability that had been calculated to produce a specific effect. She was talking to him the way someone talked when they had decided to talk without managing it, which was different from most conversations Ren had had with people of significant authority, and which required a different kind of engagement from his end. She had asked about the engagement, not the official account. She had read the official account, she said, and the official account was accurate in its facts and absent in the things that were not facts but were also true. She had asked him what the position looked like. She had asked him what the timeline had been. She had asked, and this was the question he had not expected, delivered in the same direct way she delivered everything. What he had been thinking about during the part of it where he knew he was going to hold regardless of what happened to him. He had sat with that question for a moment. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, he said. There's a point where the thinking is done and what's left is just doing the thing. I was in that point. She looked at him. My son described that part differently, she said. He was moving, Ren said. I was holding. They're different experiences of the same situation. Yes, she said. He said you looked like you had somewhere to be and the enemy was in the way. Ren thought about this. He thought about what he had looked like from the outside, the prince's unit moving northeast, looking back at a human sergeant firing at a pursuing force, and what that looked like from the moving end. That's not inaccurate, he said. He told me that he looked back twice, she said. The second time was when they were clear. He said you were still there. I was still there for a while after that, Ren said. I know, she said. The extraction report covers the full timeline. She was looking at the tablecloth in the way of someone who has held information for a long time and is in the process of setting some of it down. He is not demonstrative, my son. He is a soldier in the specific way of people who were raised inside a military tradition. He understands the importance of what he saw, but he does not say important things in an uncomplicated way. She paused. He told me about it without asking me to do anything about it. He told me as an account, a thing that had happened that I should know. I determined that I should do something about it. You didn't have to, Ren said. No, she said. I didn't have to, that's why I am. She looked at him directly. What is owed for a thing like this cannot be paid by a formal recognition. I have given formal recognitions for 43 years. I know what they are and what they are not. What they are is the institutional acknowledgement of meritorious service, which is appropriate and correct, and is not what this required. She looked at the chair, the specific, brief look of someone registering where they are and why they chose to be there. What this required was that I come to where you are. Ren looked at his plate. He looked at the table. He looked at the hall full of military professionals who were having conversations and were also, peripherally and continuously, aware of Table 16, and he thought about Grid 7 and 17 minutes, and the prince's unit moving northeast, and the way the timeline had felt from the holding end, which was not the way it appeared in the official account, or in the account of a soldier looking back from the retreating end. I'm glad he's all right, he said again, because it was still the truest thing and he did not have anything more adequate than true. She looked at him. The chromatic markings were in the register he had been watching across the dinner, and had not resolved into a reading he was confident in, not the formal display, not the distress pattern from the briefing documents, something that existed in a different part of the register that he did not have documentation for, and was reading by instinct rather than reference. "Yes," she said, "so am I." They finished dinner. At the documentary technicality, Velkoreth found, somewhere in the 73rd minute, that the moment had unexpectedly returned. The table had arrived at a quality of atmosphere that accommodated it, and delivered the resolution to an audience of 4, including the Empress, who asked a follow-up question about the deceased general's posthumous documentation authority that demonstrated she had been paying attention, and which sent Velkoreth into a supplementary account that extended the story by 11 minutes and was, Wren assessed, the best 11 minutes of a thoroughly unusual evening. The Protocol Division's document was on the Empress's desk at 9 the following morning. It was 4 pages. It addressed the precedent implications of the previous evening in the careful, thorough language of an institution that had documented 87 coalition banquets, and was now in possession of an 88th that required different documentation. The document identified 7 distinct protocol precedents that the evening had potentially established, 4 ambiguities in the formal recognition framework that the event had surfaced, and 1 question, framed carefully, in the diplomatic language of people who understood that certain questions needed to be asked carefully, about whether the seating arrangement should be reflected in the official banquet record, and if so, how. She read it. She set it aside. She did not respond to it, which was itself a response, and the Protocol Division, receiving the silence, produced a supplementary document that addressed the question of whether the Empress's silence constituted precedent guidance, determined that it did, and filed it accordingly. The aide, Vethori, brought the morning briefing with the composed efficiency of someone who had processed the previous evening on personal time and had arrived at work in the professional register. She was, Velsoren had thought, going to be an excellent aide. She confirmed this by not mentioning the banquet once during the briefing, which was the correct call, and by having pulled the official record of the Grid 7 engagement and attached it to the morning correspondence without being asked, which was better than correct. The engagement record was on her desk when the morning briefing concluded. She had read it the night before. She had pulled it 3 weeks ago, when her son's account had clarified the specific unit and position, and had read it with the attention she brought to documents whose contents she was going to carry. She read it again now in the morning light, with the knowledge of the person the account described sitting differently than it had before she had sat beside him. The official account described the holding action in the language of official accounts: operational, factual, stripped of texture. Position held under sustained fire, extraction route maintained, hostile advance contained. The language was accurate in the way of facts that were true and did not encompass what they were describing. She had known this when she read it the first time. She knew it differently now. He looked like he had somewhere to be and the enemy was in the way. Her son was not given to sentences like that. He was a soldier, and soldiers described things in operational terms, because operational terms were the language their training had built for exactly this kind of description. He had given her that sentence when she had asked him to tell her what it had been like from where he stood, which was the question underneath the official account, and he had thought about it for a long moment, and then given her the most specific thing he had. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. She set the record down and looked at the window and thought about what had been said and not said, and what was left, which was not resolution. Resolution was not the available category for something like this, but the specific, settled quality of something that had been carried and had been set down in the right place. At the 7th Support Unit's barracks on the station's military residential level, Sergeant Ren Voss was experiencing the specific quality of a morning after an unusual evening in a military context, which was that every person he encountered between his quarters and the unit's common room had a different version of what had happened and varying degrees of confidence in the version they had. The versions ranged from accurate to elaborated to one account that had introduced elements he was fairly certain had not been present at the original event. He navigated them with the equanimity of someone who had a reference point that the versions were not going to reach, and ate breakfast, and submitted the evening's activity to the internal accounting, where he put things that were significant and that he was going to understand better over time than he understood them now. Corporal Marin found him at the table with the energy of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment and had determined this was it. She sat down. She looked at him. "Table 16, she said. "Table 16, he confirmed. "I told you it was good," she said. He thought about the food, which had been hot, and the sound levels, which had been manageable, and the sight lines, which had not been so direct that he was obligated to watch the speeches for the entire duration. He thought about the documentation technicality and Velkorath's 11-minute supplementary account, and an Empress who had asked a follow-up question about posthumous administrative authority, with the complete attention of someone who was genuinely curious about the answer. "You did," he said. "I didn't anticipate the specific configuration," she said. "No," he said. "Neither did I." The message from the Imperial Communications Office arrived the following week, on a Tuesday, delivered to the 7th Support Unit's administrative officer with the formal header of official Imperial correspondence, and routed to Ren through the standard chain with the specific, handled quality of a document that every pair of hands between its origin and its destination had been careful not to read and had probably read. He opened it at his desk in the late afternoon, with the low light that the barracks took on at that hour and the ambient sound of the unit doing its end-of-day business around him. The header was formal. The content was plain. "The Empress Vel Anthesara requests a meeting at your convenience with Sergeant Ren Voss, 7th Support Unit, at a time and location suitable to his schedule. This invitation is extended in a personal rather than ceremonial capacity. The purpose of the meeting is a conversation that the dinner at table 16 began and did not finish, specifically regarding the events at Grid 7 in the detail that the official engagement record does not contain. There is no obligation attached to this invitation and no protocol requirements. A response at your convenience would be appreciated." He read it twice. He read it the way he read things he wanted to understand before he decided what to do with them. The first time for the facts, the second time for what the facts meant. He thought about Grid 7. He thought about 17 minutes and what they had felt like from the inside, which he had not given anyone the full account of because the full account was the kind of thing he had not had a reason to give until someone asked the question that was underneath the official record, rather than a question the official record could answer. He thought about a woman who had come to table 16 rather than summoning him to the dais, who had eaten dinner in a banquet hall at table 16, while 412 people recalibrated their understanding of the evening, who had sat in the specific chair she had chosen because, sitting, there was the only adequate response to what had happened in the position it represented. He thought about a 26-year-old prince moving northeast, and the look back at the moment they were clear, and what a sergeant at a holding position looked like from the moving end when the sergeant was still there. He pulled up the response form. He wrote one word, he sent it.